Hello and welcome to this event. I'm Dr. J.T. Welsh. I'm a senior lecturer here at University of York in the Department of English and Related Literature. And I thank you all for joining us on the final morning of this year's Festival of Ideas here at University of York. We're here this morning to talk to Professor Josh Cohen about this book, How to Live, What to Do in Search of Ourselves in Life and Literature. So I'm going to introduce Josh in just a moment, but first, a few kind of housekeeping technical bits. If you're watching this live, we are going to be having some time for question and answer later on in this hour, but feel free at any point. There should be a Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen where you can ask questions at any point, and we'll get to them later on. So please do leave some questions there. If you do have any technical issues, if your Wi-Fi drops out at any point, you can use that same link to rejoin the event at any time. And the event is also being recorded. You may have had a notification, so you can rewatch later at some point. We'll let you know. And finally, there are subtitles available if you would like. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen for live transcript where you can switch those on and off. But yes, without further ado, I'd like to introduce Josh Cohen, a very special guest today. Josh is a professor of modern literary theory at Goldsmiths, University of London, as well as a psychoanalyst in private practice. He's the author of various books and articles on modern literature, cultural theory, psychoanalysis, including How to Read, Freud, The Private Life, Why We Remain in the Dark, and Not Working. And yes, as I said, this how to live and what to do we're going to be discussing here today. Welcome, Josh.
Thank you so much, Daisy. So lovely to be here.
Yeah, oh, thank you. And I love the book. We were chatting before, and I was trying to refrain from asking all of my different questions. So I think just for everybody listening, we're gonna have a conversation for a bit here. I've got questions, and I think we're gonna get a bit of a reading at some point in the midst of there, and then we'll switch over and we'll have some questions from the audience. So yes, please do leave those questions in the Q&A section. Maybe we can start with just the kind of basics. I think one of the things I was so struck by is just how many different layers there are to this book, and even kind of in terms of like where it would belong in the bookshop. Like, what is it? It has moments where it does feel, I guess it has a flavor of a, kind of self-help. The title certainly promises some kind of guidance, but a lot of times there's memoir that comes into it. There's psychoanalytic theory. There's literary criticism. Can you tell us about how you think of it and how you kind of conceived the project?
Yeah, it's a great question. I've wondered, not only since it's become a finished product circulating, but actually while I was writing it. I think one of the questions that animated the writing was, well, what is it that I want to do here? Because it's true, there are many elements that I'm trying to integrate and also oscillate between. So there's a passage of memoir which is followed by a sort of generalized meditation on a particular kind of emotional predicament or life dilemma that segues into perhaps a relevant clinical case. And punctuating all of this, of course, are reflections on particular literary texts and literary characters. So what is it that brings all of this together? I think what I want it to be is a meditation on the relationship between imaginative life and our reality. And to get across the idea that imaginative life is not something that happens in our leisure time, or that we can sort of hive off into a compartmentalized space separate from our reality. That our imaginative life accompanies us and has a kind of ghostly, animating presence in our lives from day to day. One of the ways this manifests, of course, is in great characters from the worlds of literature in this case, but also, of course, from film and TV, and also from that sort of gray zone between fiction and reality, like celebrity culture, like the way that certain movie stars or pop stars occupy this special fantasized place in our inner lives. So I think that while I'm talking about, Julien Sorel Black at one moment, and about a patient at another moment, and about an episode from my own childhood or adolescence at another, I think that's the red thread that runs through all of the different strands.
And that, I guess, within that idea of structuring around this literary kind of these readings of these different characters and the way they come to life, and like you say, and I want to ask all kinds of questions about that, negotiating those differences. But I guess a more general question, I guess, is just about, like, is there an impulse there to kind of defend or champion, like, the value of literature in terms of, like, kind of, bettering ourselves, as the subtitle suggests, that it isn't just a frivolous pastime?
Yes, although I think in a slightly hesitant way. I'm sort of an advocate, but a skeptical advocate of the idea of literature as improving. Because improving in what way? What are we talking about? If we say to make you a better person or to live better, what exactly, what are the unspoken values and assumptions that are going into those judgments? So I don't think of literature as communicating to us a better set of morals or better sort of code for living. And in some ways, the title is a sort of gentle irony, because it's actually it's filched from the title of a Stevens poem, a Wallace Stevens poem, who's a great American modernist poet, who I know you'll be very familiar with. And How to Live, What to Do is a poem that really doesn't seem to do exactly what it says on the tin. It's a poem in which the speaker of the poem and a companion, who could be a friend, a lover, a stranger, a dog, but they set out in one kind of landscape looking for some kind of metaphysical or supernatural wonder, a sun full of fire, the speaker says. And instead, what they come up against is this massive tufted rock. It's a kind of replaying of a famous moment in Wordsworth's Prelude, really, where he comes up against the silence. There are a number of moments like that, Wordsworth, of course, and just contemplates the sheer there-ness of a rock. And this is really what happens here. Instead of a kind of a fireworks and a choral accompaniment, what they get is this very bare, bald piece of rock and the sound of the wind in their ears. And I think is as much as Stevens is willing to say about How to Live and What to Do, which is to say, be receptive to what is in front of you, to the life and to the world that is in front of you, rather than seeking to run into some sort of, fantastical notion of where you should be or what would be better. Find all the imaginative charge, all the excitement, all the strangeness of life in this moment. And I think I'm with Stevens in that that's pretty much as far as I want to go as well. That there is something, if we allow it to be, pretty fascinating about all lives, including the boring bits, including the humdrum bits. And so I think that literature, rather than taking us into either escapist spaces or into morally or otherwise improving transformations of our lives, what it does is it helps us attend more carefully and precisely to both the world around us and, of course, the world inside us.
Yeah, the Stevens poem is one I love as well. So I really, I like, and it's very late on in the book that you kind of bring that back around and explain your take on it. But I guess it's become clear at that point, as you say, there's a bit of irony in that this isn't actually going to be a book telling us how to live and what to do, and not breaking it down in, I guess, some of the more kind of formulaic, kind of didactic ways that we might be struck in other contexts with. And it feels like quite an active thing that it's asking for from the reader, that search, I guess. Is that a way of thinking of that? It's a sort of project that you're setting out for the reader.
Yes, I think that also speaks to the layers that you were talking about at the beginning, that I think sort of paragraph for paragraph, it's not a terribly difficult book to read, but I think where it does ask for activity is to sort of navigate your own way through the book, through the different strands. I try not to spell out too baldly the link between, a case and a character. There are obviously echoes between cases and characters, but unless you're really willing to contrive, you're not going to get exact rhymes between what happens in your cases and what happens in characters, partly because, of course, the characters often issue from very far away places and very far away times. And the conditions of their lives are very different to the ones that are going to come to a 21st century consulting room. So it's not a sort of easy universalism that just says, experiences like this for all people, and look, we can read books and it tells us that, exactly what our problems are now. But the echoes, the sort of the strange sense that this book, even though it speaks to me from across a chasm of time and space, nonetheless, wondrously, it speaks to me. I find myself somewhere in it.
Because I was going to ask about that. I guess that process of choosing the books that you feature. I mean, I was struck by, there's a quote, it's sort of halfway through, where you say, a psychoanalyst shouldn't look to literature for confirmation of what he already knows, but to be surprised. And that, I guess, figures into what you were saying from the other side, that in writing the book, that you were going back to, I guess, in some cases, books that you knew quite well, but finding different things there. Could you say a bit about how you chose them and how you surprised yourself with?
Yes, and it was one of the toughest asks, really, of writing a book like this. I sort of knew that the format was that there would be 8 chapters, each in a different state of life, and each of those chapters would look at 3 different characters, so 24 books. And I wanted there to be a sort of liberal selection across history. I wanted to not make it too parochial and have some examples from European and non-European, non-Anglophone literature. Well, not non-Anglophone, because the non-European books are Anglophone books. But the idea in the end, I think what helped me whittle it down, was that they had to be books that I had some kind of history with, that had, where there were sort of accretions of experience. I guess I would have had to have read them all more than once, because they would have to have a kind of companionable place in my life. And they're books that I think needed to have changed for me. I mean, just to take one example off the top of my head, Jane Eyre is a book that I read as a kind of in early adolescence first, and was one of the books that sort of turned me on to the classics as sort of obsessional page turners, books that, rather than sort of, reading in compliant reverence, you actually immersed yourself in and got lost in. And so it was read very much from a narrative point of view. But as you accrue experience and, you sort of, I suppose, understanding of everything from historical context to the kinds of political issues that are raised by the book, it becomes a kind of deeper and more complicated book. And I think that was the principle, really, that guided me. There were a lot of books that I thought about, that I'd read over the last, say, 10 or 15 or 20 years, that I'd loved, but that I'd read once, and that would have been very interesting to write about. but that I didn't have a charged personal relationship to. So almost every book in this book is one that I do have a kind of long-standing personal relationship to. Or if it's a more recent book like Sally Rooney's Conversations with Friends, or like Marilyn Robinson's Gilead, they're still books that sort of got under my skin, and that I was kind of in dialogue with for a long time after reading them.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting selection of texts, and I guess I was struck by the links, I guess, that how that fits in with the autobiographical kind of side of things, and that there is a sense that the books that we read or that we find, lifelong kind of companionship in, it can be a bit haphazard. I guess it can be kind of circumstantial that you happen to come across a book. I guess do you have a sense in terms of this searching for kind of resonances in fictional characters of like what the balance is between, can we find that in any literature, or how much do we curate and kind of choose literature or other kinds of culture that we, should we be seeking out things that we think will do something for us in that regard?
I'm thinking of this title of a Miranda July book, It Chooses You, because I tend to think that, of course, we choose the books that we read and the movies that we watch and the music that we listen to, but the ones that have this companionable status for us, that really become part of who we are, part of our sense of self-definition, those books choose us, I think. I think there's an enigmatic quality about them. They kind of drive us crazy. I mean, certainly, since I was an adolescent, I've been talking to friends about certain albums that do this, or pieces of music that do this, that seem to hit some strange, maybe quite vulnerable spot in us, that seem to have this alchemical capacity to be speaking to us. They say about a sort of very charismatic figures in a way that can be both wonderful and rather sinister, that they have a capacity to make you feel like you're the only person in the room, or that they've chosen to talk to you alone. I think, important cultural works have that same capacity. They make us feel that we're in an intimate personal relationship with them, even if we know that the rest of the world loves them too. And we can sort of feel, I think, weirdly competitive and envious about these non-existent, inanimate objects. We want to say, well, yes, but, that book loves me more than it loves you. You do understand that, I get the trial, or it gets me better than it gets you, something like that.
Yeah, that you sort of claim it and it makes claims on you. And no, it's a really and that, I guess that comes through, like you said, in those different layers. I wonder could you read a bit from the book now and give us a taste of that dynamic?
Sure. I think what I'm going to read is a bit from the passage on D.H. Lawrence, because Lawrence is, I think, somebody that we think of as having a kind of very dark, very fraught, very highly charged view of intimate relationships, which of course he does. I'm trying to make the argument in this book that he actually has a lot to tell us about how to manage intimacy, how to live it. So I thought this was something that all of us, in one way or another, who are here, who are present today, will have an interest in. So there's a passage which I won't read from The Rainbow, in which Will and a newly married couple have a big row because she's doing housework and he's standing uselessly in the way. So at the end of the passage, she says, go for a walk, she continued. Go down to the marsh. Don't hang about as if you were only half there. So that's the end of the quote. What could be more ordinary, banal even? Versions of this row are repeated in households everywhere, all the time. Woman gets busy, man stands about uselessly, woman becomes irritable, man retreats into a bubble of self-pity and hurt pride. If you're in a long-term partnership and don't recognize some version of this dispute, your relationship is either a shining example of domestic cooperation or a ticking time bomb. But the ordinariness of the scene is made extraordinary by Lawrence rewriting it as a skirmish in an ongoing war of unconscious forces. Beneath the familiar surface of marital bickering is a violent revolt against the pressures of intimacy. As soon as Anna tries to recover a self and a life separate from her husband, his presence, so enticing just a few days earlier, drives her to an irritation beyond bearing, which she unleashes in blind fury. Will reacts with a rage of his own, black and electric. And this is a short quote from the book. There followed 2 black and ghastly days when she was set in anguish against him, as he felt as if he were in a black, violent underworld, and his wrists quivered murderously, and she resisted him. He seemed a dark, almost evil thing, pursuing her, hanging on to her, burdening her. She would give anything to have him removed. You need some work to do, she said. You ought to be at work. Can't you do something? End of quote. Reading this overall passage, it's easy to see why more readers bristle at Lawrence. Why can't he be more of a realist in both the literary and the everyday sense? Why this wild disproportion between the external content of the row and the couple's internal experience of it? Surely this creates a skewed and exaggerated picture of the everyday texture of married life. And what I go on to say is that really these apparent exaggerations are what marriage feels like, not from the outside. Lawrence doesn't give us sort of bickering and rows from a kind of transcript perspective that allows us to see sort of 2 people quarreling about nothing. Instead, he sees the words as just the surface of something that is going on in their guts, in the depths of their souls, that however trivial the content of the row sounds, what they're really fighting is not about the housework or him hanging around uselessly. What they're fighting about is proximity. And there's a passage early in the book where I quote Middlemarch and Dorothea Brooke, who says that there is something almost awful in the nearness that marriage brings. And I think it's because, well, I would say this, of course, but I think it's because intimate relationships of one kind or another don't just bring us up against another person's interests and sort of desires and alternative agendas. They bring us up against another person's inner life, another person's unconscious. And actually, that can be overwhelming in a way that's difficult to explain. And the reason Lawrence is so surprising is because he shows us why somebody else is in a life, how somebody else is in a life, and sort of get into and overwhelm ours and leave us confused and suffocated and unable to know anymore what we want to say or what we feel or what we think. And although this can sound sort of overwrought and metaphysical from one angle, there's something quite practical about it. He's kind of telling us, look, if you want to know why it's so difficult rubbing alongside somebody else, don't just take the behavioral route and say, well, you know, try and give each other half an hour's space or have a nice cup of tea together and, you know, discuss your problems. He's trying to tell you, look, if you're going to really live with intimacy, you're living with the intimacy of another person's inner life, not just the way they go about their external business in the day. And for me, there's something hopeful in there, as well as something kind of painful and difficult.
Mm. Yeah, I think that in some ways that's one of the things that really comes through in the book, that kind of bringing these characters to life. And I guess, I mean, like, frankly, like, reading them in ways that I, coming, in a literary context, that sometimes we're told not to do. We're told not to treat characters as if they were real people, and it's really striking what happens when we do that kind of, like, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, in a way, there's something comical about this for me because, when I had the chance to do this book, I thought, well, I probably need to think about the fact that my academic title is Professor of Literary Theory. And here I am, apparently sort of making the most sort of outre, embarrassing 101 mistake in literary criticism, which is treating fictional characters as though they were real. And in a way, there is an experiment in saying, well, if you undertake this naive, philosophically treacherous move, is it interesting to find out what happens when you do that? And to me, it is interesting. And I think it's partly about what you're trying to do when you're doing that. So what I hope I don't do at any point is sort of a diagnostic approach. I'm not interested, for example, in whether Julien Sorel is a malignant narcissist, or if Esther Greenwood, has a severe melancholia or some borderline personality disorder. I think all of that would raise absolutely rightful objections. In a way, the thing for me that makes this feel like it makes sense on a conceptual level and not just on a sort of intuitive level is I'm interested in who are these characters for us? How do they live in us? And that's where I think the sort of the lessons we learn in A level or in our first sort of seminars at university, there needs to be a bit of supplementation, because when we say, look, these are fictional characters and don't treat them as though they were real, we are missing what books are, what novels are for so many of us that read them. And there is something a little willful and inhumane about telling 18-year-olds who have lived with, say, Holden Caulfield all their lives, and who has been somebody immensely real to them, in the knowledge that, of course, he's also not real, that he occupies this sort of strange, enigmatic space between the imaginative and the real. But to say, no, now you've got to grow up and confine these characters to the unreal, the imaginative world, I think it, in a way, has the potential to impoverish our reading experience, and also not quite to do justice to what it is. So I think part of understanding the way fiction works is how it speaks to us, how it calls up resources and dimensions of ourselves which we don't necessarily recognize, which make us sort of suddenly wake up to ourselves in ways that, instead of being reassuringly familiar, are unsettling. That introduce us to dimensions of ourselves that we don't necessarily know, or we've known in a very sort of inchoate way, and that give a kind of shape to that knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, because one of the things I think where I was a bit, I don't know, like, apprehensive isn't the right word, but just kind of piqued and curious is by these assessments, these kind of character assessments that run throughout the book, that whenever you introduce a new section, there's a kind of, I'm glad the way you describe it, for the way you described it there, because as you say, it's not diagnostic, but it does sort of imagine in quite a playful way, at least how I read it, what these characters would be like in the context of analysis. Could you say about, like, the difference between the characters and then the patients that you talk about in the book, which you say are kind of amalgams and
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So what JP's talking about is there are these little sort of thumbnail portraits of the characters, but they're written in the style of, I suppose it could be almost a psychiatric report or perhaps a social work assessment. And it is playful. It tries to simultaneously get at and parody the idea of a kind of diagnostic reading. And what's been interesting for me is that I've realized that some people have taken them pretty literally, have thought that, these were meant to be sort of serious, psychiatric assessments of the characters. They're more like, in a way, they're sort of little object lessons in how not to read a character, because they're reductive and slightly comical. So, it says about Gatsby, for example. It asks if there are safeguarding issues about the fact that this guy seems to be stalking somebody, and the clinical cases that I write about, as you say, in very hybridized composite form. So hopefully nobody who's written about could possibly recognize themselves, because so much has been changed. But they really are there to provide a sense of the texture of a psychotherapy, which is very different, I think, from a diagnostic exercise in which the other person is reduced to a series of symptoms. It tries to give you a sense of psychotherapy as an encounter between two emotional and imaginative lives, trying to make sense of one of those lives. It also tries to show how the work can end up surprising both parties, both the therapist and the client, that both of us can end up finding ourselves introduced to elements of our inner lives that, again, we weren't so fully aware of. And this is, I think, a kind of a capacity that is shared between psychotherapeutic work and literary reading.
Yeah. And I think that it feels like there are lots of places too where that acknowledgement of that kind of gap as well, that, as you said, of not being able to just reduce another person or a character to that description, and even those moments in the kind of the accounts of the therapy sessions and where you're at a loss for words. There's a really striking moment, I guess, is sort of analogous to that, where I think as you're having a conversation with your son, and he talks about he's sort of despairing about climate change, and you don't really know, as a parent, you're sort of struggling with the kind of like that generational gap and the kind of the reality of the fears that he's talking about, which and I guess it was like a moment that really captured the sense of the changes through life that the book is structured around, and that distance from yourself, I guess, as you go through. I wonder if you could just say a bit more about how that sense of that knowability of characters and others is sort of balanced by those unknowable kind of moments.
Yes. That has absolutely a resonance with what happens to our relationship to fictional characters, because I think what I'm probably trying to convey in that encounter with my son is a generational gap, not only between him and me, but between me and myself. That there is a kind of very vulnerable, anxious adolescent in me. I mean, when I was growing up, the apocalyptic anxiety was less about global heating and more about nuclear weapons. And I remember being kept awake by similar anxieties, really, about the end of the world. I think the ones that my son is suffering are undoubtedly more real and more incremental and unfolding in front of our eyes. And I think he seems so directly in contact with what this means for not only the future of the external world, but for his own internal future. What is it possible to hope for? What does it mean to love someone or to have ambitions or hopes for one's own life, whether these are, about professional achievement or about emotional happiness? How is that possible if the nagging intimation of disaster that we're facing? And he so I think what moved me deeply about the conversation is how this was part of the texture of his life. It should have been part of the texture of my life. But I realized talking to him that I developed this adult or middle-aged crust, which interposed between me and the anxiety, a kind of defensive shield, which, of course, has become the way we've learned to live with impending, and not just impending, existing climate disaster, by interposing between us and it a kind of a wall of unseeingness, really, carrying on as if it weren't there, as if life was just going to carry on continuing as normal. And that was a compact which I realized he and hopefully a large tranche of his generation were not prepared to enter into. And there's a kind of parallel there then with the history that you can have with fictional characters who I think have a capacity to tear you out of the same kind of complacency, to prevent you sort of moving from one moment to the next in a kind of haze of breezy complacency, which just assumes that the next moment is going to unfold in the same way that the last one did. And, you just carry on life as normal from day to day and week to week and month to month and so on. And one of the texts that really resonates in that regard is Mrs. Dalloway, the great novel by Virginia Woolf, because it is a novel about humdrum everydayness. It takes place on a single day in June in London, and it's about nothing so earth-shattering as the planning of the planning by a Tory MP's wife of an evening party for society's great and good. So we could say, what could be more trivial, more privileged, more uninteresting? And what Woolf forces us to do is in a moment, I think, of extraordinary humanity and empathy, to see that actually there's a kind of raging and tragic interior drama being played out even as all this humdrum activity is going on. And there is this passage which I find unbearably moving, where this woman in her early 50s is not particularly well physically, is shoving chairs about the room in preparation for the party, and is suddenly struck by a kind of flash of her love of life, of her love of the world. And it's quite incomprehensible, because it doesn't belong to the content of the moment, really. She's not doing anything very interesting or very different from what she was doing before. But there is a revelation because she's suddenly aware of her presence in the world, of herself as a finite being, as somebody who's living a life that is going to end one day. And there is something sad, but also wondrous and joyful about this. And what's dramatic and exciting about it for me in a way that it couldn't have been when I first read this book in my 20s. I just don't think that I really picked this up. But what became very exciting about it was that it kind of wrenched me out of the my sort of easy position.
I found all that so resonant as well, and I was questioning whether it was my age too, like whether, so the further I got on in the life cycle of the book, the more I related. I mean, there's a line right near the end that sort of felt, I was like sort of jotting it down for my own personal keep about that. It's at the point that we settle, that we take the peculiarly radical step of surrendering to the life we have in all its unexceptional ordinariness. And that's when we feel free to do and be whatever we want. That line, yeah, that connecting with what you were saying about Clarissa Dalloway. But that's we've got a few questions here. So that's I'm going to go into these. So the first of these, this comes from Arthur, who's asking, do you think that there are repeated trends or particular lessons we can try and find in literature constantly? Or do we turn to different things at different points in our lives? I think this is something the book is very...
Oh, yeah. That's such an interesting question. I think that it's a bit of both, actually. I think that it's often interesting to think about the books that have meant things to us at different stages of our lives. And of course, they belong to such different moments. And, there are young person's books like Alice, and there are older person's books like Mrs. Dalloway. And on the one hand, they serve the needs of a moment. They speak to us at a certain point in life that they probably couldn't have spoken to us much earlier on. And yet, I think that if you sort of try the thought experiment of drawing not one line, but lines between the books that have meant things to you, you're almost sure to see repeated trends. You're almost sure to see lines of continuity. Alice and Clarissa Dalloway look very far apart, except, of course, they both have this quite extravagant imaginative life and live in proximity to that. And in a way, Alice lives the life that Clarissa, the sort of expansive, imaginative life that Clarissa has closed down, but which we see glimpses of, particularly in that sort of glorious bodily memory of a kiss with Sally Seton, who we meet again later in the novel as a sort of matronly society woman. But this sort of moment of glorious erotic transgression, it is not just about the body, but it's also about the imagination, about how a moment can electrify your life. I think a lot of the books that we love in childhood have some resonance of that as well. They sort of are about sort of interior electrification, if you like.
Yeah, well, there's another question here. I think that follows on from that nicely, and it sort of connects back to what we were saying before. What you're saying before about the choices of the book. Someone is asking, aside from the examples that you've mentioned, I guess are there other literary texts that you return to again and again. And I guess they're asking what interesting twist on this thing is like, is it always the classics? And is that what makes them classics? Is there something about the value of literature inherent in this?
Yeah. So I'm sort of alive to all the contemporary debates, of course, around decolonization and how that inflects the question and my answer. Because to say simply, well, the classics that have survived are the ones that speak to, our universal conditions as human beings, as though there were no sort of social and historical and many other kinds of differentiations that make that universality quite complicated. So I'm wary of saying that that's why classics survive. Classics survive for various kinds of reasons, which are to do with a history of cultural value and judgment and privilege. And that's why certain kinds of texts get excluded by women, by people of color, by people on other parts of the world than the Anglosphere and continental Europe. So I'll say that. I will also say that I think that there is more to literary fame and to literary endurance than cultural privilege or prestige. I don't think it's reducible to the play of cultural power. That's obviously there. Why certain books get privileged and why certain books don't does have something to do with that, a lot to do with that. But there is also a way that those enduring books that Shakespeare or Kafka or Charlotte or Emily Bronte or Jane Austen, they, I think, have this capacity that I've been trying to talk about to surprise us, to give us a version of human experience that is multi-layered and surprising and that shakes us out of our complacency. So I certainly don't want to endorse a sort of heritage version of the classics that are morally and spiritually improving. But I do think that there are books that endure because they speak not to some sort of easy relatability about universal problems and dilemmas, but because they draw out these sort of strange dimensions of us. They sort of, I suppose, give us life in a way that is much harder to see in the everyday.
I think there's another question here. I think again that sort of follows on. It's a bit more specifically about the kinds of characters. Someone's asking what it implies for readers who feel like they relate more to characters in novels who live on the margins and have more kind of precarious existences. Is there, and I know you've got lots of different kinds of characters that you cover here, but is there something about that, a different kind of relatability that, is differently aspirational or however? Yeah.
Yes. I think that, it's a very contemporary question, because I think that we have a kind of informal social system and a formal educational system that really values compliance. An educational system which increasingly squeezes out the disciplines of the imagination, and that wants to turn us into functional units of economic productivity and purposefulness. And you also have, I think, a strong drive to compliance and conformity on social media. The drive to acquire the perfect Instagram body or the perfect Instagram home. And it can, I think, make it quite difficult then to know what to do, if you like, with an inner life that just doesn't know how to sort of accommodate itself to these kinds of demands. I think that's probably true of most of us, actually, but some of us, I think, are probably better, learn better to fall in with a sort of a culture of compliance and conformity, or at least we appear to be better at it. Who knows what's going on underneath? And some of us feel very defiant about it. And that's when I think that literature becomes a really valuable life companion. And again, I mean, I've alluded more than once to Kafka, but I think Kafka, so many people relate to Kafka, even though it would seem that there's nothing in the real world to relate to, because he presents us with a dystopian nightmare world, which is really at such an oblique angle to the world that we know. And the characters behave, the central characters behave in a way, in such inexplicable, strange ways. And yet, I think that there is something about the atmosphere of persecution, of coming into contact with the sort of the outer edges of experience, that people read in Kafka and think, I know something about that. Or again, this book knows something about me. Mm. And I tend to think that that's what great novels do, that they make us feel seen in the core of ourselves, in a way that we weren't fully aware of. And I think that that has something to do with why particularly sort of marginal characters appeal to us so much. Failures. Funnily enough, and my next book is a very short, sort of, well, it's a long essay really, but it's called Losers. And it's about, it's in large part about my identification with a group of writers who write about, and who themselves in their own lives might have been described as losers.
Mm. Well, that sounds amazing. Sounds, I mean, fascinating. I guess, we are running out of time here. There is a few more questions, so I guess kind of summarizing a few different these. You mentioned earlier, I think it was near the start, you kind of said, you don't say this in the book, but you were saying that you thought characters from things like TV and film have a similar kind of potential for giving a sense of our different selves and things. I wondered, like, if you could just say a bit more, I guess, both about that widening of cultural, fictional characters and celebrity culture that you mentioned, but then also, is there something specific about literature and how a character who's sort of configured on the page, how we process that?
Yeah, I think it's a matter of different ways that they give us of understanding ourselves. I tend to think that we love great movie and TV characters because they allow us to commune more with our social selves. We love sort of catchphrases or mannerisms or gestures. One of the characters off the top of my head that I love is the Big Lebowski. And Lebowski is somebody, of course, we have lots of catchphrases, well, that's just your opinion, man. That I think sort of facilitates social recognition. People like to quote lines to each other as though what's happening is that there are layers of life that are being recognized in between us. Film is part of a kind of fabric of social cultural interaction. I think the relationship we have to literature, although it can be like that, it is more interior. And I think the reason this book concentrates on literature and not on a sort of a wider, more expansive base of cultural characters is because I think you tend to have a more private, intimate relationship with fictional characters. They're people that you carry inside you, whereas movie characters are maybe companions that walk alongside you. You know, that you can sort of switch into occasionally, as a kind of cultural code. You know, you can become Lebowski, or you can become Al Pacino and Scarface, or whoever comes to mind at the moment. Those are slightly weird examples, and probably reveal more than I would want about me.
Well, I think, yeah, no, it's really fascinating. I mean, you've piqued our interest about the next book as well. Someone's asking in the question, if do you know when that will be published, or is that a work in progress with Losers? Oh,
yes, at the beginning of September. Yes, it'll be out the beginning of September. It's also a book about the sort of the pathological aversion to losing. It looks like my videos had to be
sorry,
stopped,
yeah, I know, right at the end here. Yeah. Well, it does. I mean, well, maybe the timing is all right, because it does mostly just remain, for me to thank you, and if we were all here kind of giving a round of applause together. But yes, so Losers will be out, maybe later this year. But in the meantime, whatever stage of life you're at, I can't recommend this enough. Really, really fascinating book, really kind of an experimental format, doing interesting things, just a totally refreshing way of thinking about literature and what it can teach us. Thank you, Josh.
Thank you so much, JT. It's been such a pleasure talking to you, and thank you also everyone for questions. I really enjoyed those too.
Yeah, thanks. Hope to see you all soon enough back properly in York. But be well, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks a lot, JT. Take care.